Okay, so this is what I have lined up for today. Because I don't know where everyone's coming from and everyone's background, I'm going to give a little bit of a background in corpus linguistics to make sure that I'm being clear about how I'm understanding corpus linguistics. And then I'll do the same thing with language ideology. I suspect more people will be familiar with corpus linguistics than language ideology, but I'll try to reach some common ground to make sure we're on the same page here. And then I'll present some of the challenges that arise from the combination, and I'll show how I've been dealing with these with just one case study, but of course I could speak to my experiences more broadly because this is sort of my bread and butter. This is what I really keep going back to in my own research for quite a while now. Okay, so I'll start with corpus linguistics here to tell you a bit about how I understand corpus linguistics to work. So starting with a few definitions. So the way I am approaching corpus linguistics is that corpus linguistics is the study of corpus. So what is a corpus? Well, a corpus is a body or a collection of texts. So a principled collection of computer readable text, not just any text. These are things that we probably already know. But texts are collected according to specific and predetermined criteria. Now, normally those tend to be of two different types, sometimes of both types, but sometimes of just one or the other. Linguistic criteria representing a language, variety, or dialect, and or social criteria. So representing a social phenomenon or a group of social actors. So the real question that I'm using that's driving my research and what I'm trying to use as a anchor point for this talk is what happens when the linguistic and the social criteria don't necessarily map onto one another directly. So does the linguistic always map onto the social? Does a social group always speak one particular language variety or dialect? Does a language variety map directly onto a social group or not? And I think there are important implications, both theoretically and methodologically, that we need to grapple with corpus linguistics when there is a bit of a disconnect between the linguistic and the social, because things get more complicated, especially in the day and age that we're in now. Okay, so we know a bit about corpus linguistics and what a corpus is. I'm glossing over a lot of detail here. But another premise that I'm trying to build on here is the argument made by Sinclair many years ago, that the content of a corpus should be built without regard to the language of texts that comprise the corpus, but rather according to the communicative function of those texts in the community in which they arise. So the communicative function of the community gives this angle, this focus on the social, right, rather than especially on the linguistic. And again, this is something that gets taken up, you know, sort of intertextually, but also conceptually in terms of the criteria for corpus building, like issues of balance. So here I'm drawing on the more recent CUP textbook by McInerney and Hardy, who say that balance is one criterion for corpus construction. A corpus should contain proportions of text that are relevant to the proportion in the linguistic or the social context. So again, we have that reference back to the linguistic and or the social. Representativeness. So the corpus should represent natural linguistic or social context. So again, we're trying to represent something that is either the linguistic or the social, or sometimes, but maybe not always, both. And comparability, right? Criterion for corpus construction, the degree to which a corpus can be reconstructed based on similar principles in another context. And what is that other context? Well, I'm trying to say that other context would be a linguistic context or a social context. So So that again comes from the work of McHenry and Hardy. Now, another question that I've been grappling with over the past number of years has been whether corpus linguistics is primarily a methodological approach or a toolkit that we can employ, or whether or not it involves theories. And this has been discussed in a range of different writing on corpus linguistics, especially with regard to the Neo-Firthian approach. So if you're unfamiliar with that, just let me give you a little bit of the background that I'm trying to talk about. Because even if corpus linguistics is mainly a methodological approach, there are still assumptions that underpin the tools that we're using. And if we are not critical and explicit about what those assumptions mean, then I think that that can result in problems, especially with relation to language ideology, which is where I'm headed in the next part of this presentation. So in my view, the core tools in corpus linguistics do entail certain theories that I'll be getting to in the next slide. So especially the notion of frequency. So drawing on McHenry and Hardy again here, they explain that corpora allow access to reliable information regarding frequency. Being able to search for and extract frequencies of different word forms or phrases gets us a long way. But it doesn't give us all the tools we need for every sort of research question. But essentially in corpus linguistics, when we're looking for patterns, whether those are patterns in different elements of language, whether it's parts of words, whether it's phraseology, right, bundles of words, then we're still looking at patterns, and those patterns depend on frequency, high and low frequency. So why are things frequent is really the question that underpins the extent to which we can use frequency reliably and in a motivated way to derive findings with relation to language ideology, or I would say pretty much anything else. So I'll get into what I understand frequency to be indicating, the theory underpinning it, in the next slide. And the other core principle underpinning a lot of different corpus tools is colocation. Of course, this draws on the work of J.R. Firth, whose work has not just been influential in corpus linguistics, but more broadly. But as we know, collocation has to do with the extent to which words stick next to one another, collocate. So a concordancer, for example, allows us to search for a word and retrieve from it a specific sequence of characters of any length. So those characters can be part of a word or a word, they can be part of a clause and so on. So it really just depends on what we're stipulating as a meaningful character length. So these are both tools that are employed by corpus linguists, and they entail understandings of what these mean in terms of how we use language in society. And here, I think the work of Michael Stubbs is particularly insightful in allowing us to make explicit what we're assuming about language when we draw on things like frequency and collocation. So Stubbs has argued that corpora provide empirical evidence for social theories, so allowing us to get at the social. So social theories like from Bourdieu and Giddens, who have argued that routine and mundane processes reproduce culture. If we want to have empirical evidence for that argument, we can go to corpora. So what does it mean to be routine? What does it mean to be mundane? How does that reproduce culture? We can use corpus evidence to show us that. And Stubbs has argued, not recently anymore, this is 20 years ago, 2001, that a community's value system is built up and maintained, at least partly, by the recurrent use of particular phrasings in texts. So frequent phrases and patterns are vital to communities because they facilitate understandings of connected discourse and the attitudes and values within this discourse. So what I'm trying to say is that when we as corpus linguists look at things like frequent words, we're kind of just scratching the surface of a larger issue, because frequent words aren't just arbitrarily frequent. They're frequent because they occur in frequent phrases. Frequent phrases are frequent because they relate to conventional expressions. And conventional expressions help to get us at this community internal value system. So what is believed? So when we look at that superficial level as corpus linguists, we're actually trying to theorize a relation between what people say and what is believed underpinning that, a belief system. And I don't think this is just the case for the study of language ideology either, even if we're looking at things like vocabulary acquisition, which is by no means my area of research. But if we're looking at which words are or should be acquired in a particular order, we're still looking at which words are privileged within a specific context or domain that we want to be examining. So it's the link between the linguistic and the social that is really of particular interest to me, and it has been for some time. Oh, and this came up in Twitter today. I don't know if anyone else saw this tweet, that the kind of arguments we make about frequency, like the glass is half empty or is the glass half full, a corpus linguist would give empirical evidence like, good news, everyone, the glass is more than twice as often half full than it is half empty. But why is that good news, right? It's because of the kind of value system we attribute to. If people say that it's half full, then we're saying that they're optimistic, and the fact that we can attribute that to the way that we say things. We're making assumptions about what it is that we say, how we're saying it, and what that says about us and what we believe. So if we don't focus on that link between the superficial level of what's frequent and the underpinning assumptions about what that methodological tool is trying to show us, then we can miss out on some of the pictures, and, oh, was it missing from the picture there, I think. Anyway, so the idea is that we're trying to get a better idea of what's happening in the corpus as a whole, to better understand and explain what's happening in society. Now, there have been important arguments as well that we're not just looking at high frequency when we look at corpus linguistics, we're looking also at low frequency, because it's only the comparison between the high and the low that makes high or low meaningful at all. We can't say that X number is a meaningful number. We can only say that it is more or less frequent than another number we have in our corpus. So better accounting for frequency in terms of knowing the whole scale of between the high and low is important. And Partington, for example, has argued that all corpus work is properly comparative. Even when there's just one corpus being investigated, it's being used to test the data it contains against another body of data, which may be introspection, or it may be the data found in a reference work, such as dictionary, or it may be statements made previously by authors in the field. So the argument that comparison is really at the heart of corpus linguistics is something, again, that I think is often overlooked. And with relation to high and low frequency, there's also the important issue of absence, whether or not we can account for things that are not in our corpus. And sometimes things that are missing from our corpus could be hugely important to what we're trying to get at. So trying to account not just for what is present in the data, but what is absent. And there's increasing work on this area, for example, by the work of Alan Partington, which I'll present in a few minutes, and by Charlotte Taylor especially. Okay, so to sum up my approach to corpus linguistics, how I've been understanding it and approaching it in my research. Corpus linguistics is the study of a corpus, and corpora tend to be tied to communities. And it's basically the decision of the analyst whether we're considering that community to be a linguistic community and or a social community, because the two don't necessarily map onto one another as in a one-to-one basis. So the question is, to what extent can we distinguish between the linguistic and the social? And to what extent does the language in use, the variety or the code, point us to the community? Right? Can we actually use one to get at the other or not? And can we study the social using corpus linguistics if a community uses a range of varieties or codes? So where we don't have a mapping of the linguistic onto the social and we want to look at the social community, how do we account for that when we have a range of different practices that might involve different codes? And corpora, as I'm going to argue, aren't really set up to look at that kind of diversity. So now I'll shift to the next element of this talk, which is language ideology. So I suspect that this might be slightly newer territory for some of the people attending this kind of series on corpus linguistics. So I'll spend a little bit more time getting to grips with what language ideology is here. So language ideology doesn't refer to just ideology channeled through language. It doesn't refer to language ideology generally speaking. It refers to ideologies about language. So language ideology really has to do with beliefs and values, assumptions, and belief systems about language that are so widely shared in a community. And there's this reference to community that really becomes so important throughout my talk. So in a community, we share these beliefs about language, and they become so shared that we don't need to say them out loud. They tend to underpin the way that we do things and the way that we live our lives. So they're often implicit in our social worlds. And they're often taken as common sense. So language ideology has to do with the way that we take for granted many things to do with language and how that relates to our social world around us. So in the next few slides, I'll be drawing a lot on the work of Catherine Willard and her recent chapter where she provides an overview of language ideology. And so the definition I've included on this slide, which is maybe more precise, is that language ideology relates to the morally and politically loaded representations of the nature, the structure, and use of languages in a social world. So we're not just talking about what language is, we're talking about how it should be used, who should be able to use language, where they should use it, why they should use it, when it should be used. And it relates very much to that link between the social and the linguistic. But what's important here is that we can't extract our beliefs about language from our beliefs about the world around us. So language ideologies aren't just about language. They forge links between language and other social phenomena, from identities through conceptions of personhood, proper human comportment, intelligence, aesthetics, morality, even truth, universality, and authenticity. So which language is the language of truth? Which language is the language of romance? Who is it that is a beautiful speaker? Who is it who is eloquent and articulate? These assumptions we make about people's identities, about which language we should choose to use in which domain, all relate to beliefs that we have about language, but aren't necessarily in any way scientifically based, nor should they be, because these are things that we have developed because they're part of the social world and the way that we have come to live the lives that we live. So there's maybe a vaguely interesting history to language ideology in that it comes largely from the work of linguistic anthropology. So a main figure in the field is Michael Silverstein, who developed the work of semiotician C.S. Peirce. And the work really developed in the late 1990s. So at a meeting of the American Anthropological Association, several figures came together and many publications came out of that. So some names you might be familiar with, like Jan Blommaert, Susan Gall, Catherine Willard, Paul Crosscurdy, and then the sort of seminal collection of Schieffelin, Willard, and Crosscurdy in 1998. So that late 1990s period was particularly informative. Okay, so all of this to say, language ideology has to do with beliefs and values about language, but why is this important? Why should we bother looking at language ideology? Well, again, in this recent chapter by Catherine Willard, she argues that the concept of language ideology pervasively and productively informs more studies of language in use than ever before. And I think this is hugely important because it's becoming so commonplace to study language ideology in some fields of linguistics. So linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, but it has largely been overlooked in the field of corpus linguistics. So there's very little work on language ideology that has employed corpus linguistics methods, tools, dare I say, theories, or approaches. And although I count myself among the few figures in this niche field, there are some important other names that I wanted to mention here. And just for the reasons of time, I'm not telling you or showing you more about their work, but they are important references to be aware of. So there's a lot to be done. And why has corpus linguistics and language ideology not been combined, despite the fact that language ideology is so ubiquitously studied in so many other fields of linguistics? Well, I'll get there in a few minutes. But before I get there, I wanted to tell you a few of the ways that Catherine Willard has argued that language ideology can take shape. So when we're dealing with beliefs and values about language, what are we actually dealing with? So she's argued that language ideology can take shape as material phenomena, as visual representations, for example, as embodied practices and dispositions, as mental constructs, and maybe most relevant for this talk and for a corpus linguistics approach, through verbalizations. Now, this is kind of an expanded or maybe a more precise version of her discussion of language ideology previously, because in 1998, the definitions that she provided and some of the ones that were used in other literature on language ideology really focused on the notion of articulation and verbalization or representations. So even if we look at the early work of Michael Silverstein, he says that language ideologies are these sets of beliefs about language articulated by users, okay, as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure or use. So they are things that we say. And later, Catherine Willard says, well, they're representations, but they can be explicit or implicit. So we have a little bit more precision. But because there's been this focus on verbalizations, there has been a lot of uptake on this focus about what we say about language and how we can study language ideology through what we say or don't say or what we imply. So there's been, for example, a chapter by Milani and Johnson where they combine corpus critical discourse analysis and language ideology and try to bring those together. And then there's also been the edited collection by Jan Blarmart, where there are a range of scholars look at language ideological debates. So the reason why we end up verbalizing our common sense beliefs about language is often that our expectations and assumptions about what should be happening are upset. And when we are confounded by something happening, we end up talking about it in such a way that we make explicit our beliefs about language, whereas normally they could be left unsaid because they are taken for granted and allow our world to function in the way that it does in all the banal ways that we live. So language ideological debates tend to emerge when we are upset, our expectations are upset. And there was that edited collection examining that. Okay, so that was the brief fly-by-night tour of language ideology. And this next section of the talk, I want to present some of the challenges that emerge from combining corpus linguistics and language ideology together. And then I'll end the talk by showing you how these things, not just in an abstract sense, but that I've grappled with in my own research. So the first maybe contentious argument that I want to make here is that corpora are monolingualizing. And the term monolingualizing comes from the work of Monica Heller. And I think what's important to highlight here is that the idea is that it's turning something into a monolingual entity rather than it being naturally a monolingual entity. So how is it that corpora become monolingualizing? Well, most corpora tend to be designed and conceptualized as monolingual. And there's been some interesting work, an edited collection by Nurmi, Richin, and Pata, who talk about finding multilingual elements, even when things are designed, when corpora are designed to be monolingual, there's so much multilingualism in them that tends to go against their expectations. So there's been some work on that. But even parallel, translation, and comparable corpora are monolingual in a sense, because they're separate corpora that are linked on the basis of their language. So there's still that linguistic lens rather than sort of a social lens, one that would allow for more incorporation of natural diversity. And Taylor and Delfonte give a useful overview of some recent, basically they give a typology of cross-linguistic corpus-based work. And they do give one exception to the general rule, but in general, the norm is to have corpora that are linked on the basis of language, but even when they're multilingual, they tend to involve a huge amount of monolingualism. But the more important thing that I'm trying to get at is that frequency as a tool is based on monolingual norms. So frequency calculations are bound to the languages in which they occur, in which words occur, with the exception of some cognates, but that almost creates more problems when we get into that. And of course, there is some, the work on world Englishes and English as a lingua franca is an exception. But if we think about what's most frequent in a corpus, we're going to end up with the most frequent words according to the dominant language in that corpus. So if there's language mixing in that corpus, the mixing is still going to be filtered out by the most, the language that occurs the most in that data set. Now, this poses problems because of a recent turn in applied and sociolinguistics, because an argument has been made that today's world is super diverse, not monolingual or even multilingual. And this is because the argument is that people nowadays tend to be transient rather than fixed because of possibilities of migration. And also the ability to use digital communication to overcome geographic, but even linguistic boundaries. We don't have to adhere to standard language norms. We can communicate with people and maintain heritage languages over great distances. So the argument that today's world is super diverse has implications for our understanding of how we use language. So the notion of superdiversity, which comes from the work of Stephen Retweets, has been taken up by scholars, I mean, maybe more or less starting with Ben Brampton and Jan Blommaert, who have argued that superdiversity relates to this level and complexity of diversity that surpasses anything previously experienced in a particular society. Now, some applied linguists and sociolinguists have taken issue with the notion of superdiversity, and I appreciate that. But what's important for the purposes here is to take note of this post-multilingual turn, where we're moving away from things like multilingualism, code switching, and moving towards notions of translanguaging, which is a notion that works much more naturally when we look at superdiversity, because we're not looking at boundaries between languages, people, or places. We understand that there is inherent mixing that's happening at an increasing level, and our need to account for it as applied and sociolinguists. So if you haven't come across the term translanguaging, it's argued to be, this is where we reconceptualize language as a multilingual, multisemiotic, multisensory, and multimodal resource for sense and meaning making. So it's less about the boundaries of a language and more about how we can draw on semiotic repertoires in order to get things done, drawing on various communicative resources and not just specific words that mean specific things and boundaries between languages. So another proposal that I'm trying to make in this talk is that corpora end up being language ideological constructs. And this is because if we go back to Sinclair's principle that corpora should be compiled with regard to the language they contain, without regard to the language they contain, but according to their communicative function in the community in which they arise, this principle that we should focus on the community, that despite the fact that we should not be excluding material from a corpus on the basis of linguistic criteria, corpus research often relies on ideological processes of erasure to draw conclusions. So I'll say a bit more about erasure in the next slide. But in simple terms, in order to draw frequency findings in a corpus that's meant to be an English corpus, for example, there's often the practice of filtering out non-English data. There's often a practice of normalizing spelling, even though, especially in a translanguaging approach, knowing that variation has indexical meaning, knowing that the way that people spell things differently is a meaning-making resource. When we normalize the spelling, we're glossing over that extra level of meaning. And also, we gloss over multilingual features when we undertake a lot of corpus. And these aren't, general rules that all corpus linguistics research does this. It's just that there are these trends to make the corpus data work best for the tools of frequency and collocation. And that when we're trying to fit something into a puzzle, what I think we lose is some of the meanings that are happening, that are being made in the corpus, that we're not being attuned to because we're trying to make it fit with a tool that has theoretical underpinnings. So the third point that I'm trying to say is that there is this trend to gloss over multilingual features. And just to tell you briefly, this is something in my own work where we looked at the United Nations General Debates Corpus. The United Nations is a multilingual organization, but all texts that are official from that organization are official in all translations. So if you look at all English data, you'll lose out on the processes of how people who produce those texts did many multilingual things, because the final version will be, for example, English only. So trying to account for multilingualism is impossible because the data set has been simplified and streamlined ultimately to work with a corpus linguistics toolkit. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that the erasure of diversity and multilingualism, it may facilitate corpus analysis, but this is a language ideological process that overlooks the indexical meanings of variation and diversity. So erasure in corpus research. Erasure is one of many semiotic processes that establish language ideologies. I could say a lot more about this. I tried to incorporate a slide about this into this presentation. It just didn't work. So I've reduced it down to these bullet points. But in basic terms, erasure allows for internal diversity to be simplified or ignored in favor of simplistic uniformity and homogeneity. Erasure allows for outliers, such as multilingual phenomena that are inconsistent with an ideological scheme, such as the English language, to be rendered invisible. And erasure happens in corpus linguistics research when corpora are collected on the basis of language rather than social function, or on the basis of social function with diversity being filtered out, glossed over, or normalized. So at that point, I wanted to show you how very imperfectly this kind of combination of corpus linguistics and language ideology research can be done. So not to say that this is an exemplar of good practice, but to say that the conscious reflection on these kinds of issues is something that I think might be of benefit to other corpus linguists. So in this section, I'll be telling you briefly about one of my recent papers. So this is where I looked at nationalist language ideologies in tweets about the 2019 Canadian general election. So this is in print if you wanted to read more detail about this. So here's the map of Canada that I promised I would show you. And just to show you that I am in Ottawa, so the capital of Canada right here, and Halifax is right here. So Canada's the second largest country in the world, so it's not as close as it might appear on the map. Okay, so for those of you who might not be aware, these levels of context I think are very important when we're talking about the community and the social. So, you know, just forgive me a little bit of a diversion into Canadian history, that Canada is a country with two official languages, English and French. Canada is what you might call a state nation rather than a nation state, because it was created as a state before it had any kind of national identity. And because the state came first, there has been a longstanding issue about what it means to be Canadian. Who are Canadians? What is Canadian identity? You know, a bit lost between our, you know, American neighbors and British heritage, for example. And that's important to know because the Canadian media system was developed to help construct and sort of support the creation of a national identity. And the Canadian public broadcaster, for example, has a mandate to support Canadian identity. So that's important. We're thinking about what the community is. Is Canada a community or not? That might be still a question, but if we want to investigate Canada as a community, inherently we have to be aware that there are these two official languages, but also that the Canadian context is changing. So the number of Canadians reporting a mother tongue other than English or French is rising. There's growing support for Indigenous languages. And Canadians tend to be obtaining information from online sources rather than traditional media sources that have helped to support the national identity. And I should have added a minute ago that Although the Canadian public broadcaster was created to help support the Canadian national identity, it actually exists in two different languages in parallel streams that don't interact with one another. So there is a French language public broadcaster stream and an English. So that sort of raises questions about the extent to which it constructs a single national identity, but I won't digress any further on that. So the point is that when I wanted to undertake this research, Canada's just had another general election, but in 2019, still very recently, I wanted to see the extent to which there were nationalist language ideologies, beliefs about language that were surfacing in discussions of the federal election. So in this so-called national context of a federal election, so federal being all the provinces and territories of Canada, to what extent were languages beliefs about languages being used to construct what it meant to be Canadian? So in terms of building the corpus, the first issue that I wanted to show you was how some of the conscious decisions about what to include in the corpus depended on what was being presumed to be a meaningful community in this context. So as I've already said, Canada is a tricky entity because it has the state that preceded the nation, because of the two official languages, and because of the amount of non-official language speakers in Canada. But what was really useful was that in this particular, on Twitter, where we have an ability to cross the geographic boundaries of Canada, huge country that Canada is, and cross linguistic boundaries. So on things like Twitter, you don't have to just use English or just use French in your tweets. You can use whatever languages, combinations, or other resources within a single tweet. So we aren't bound to languages in the same way that we are in other text types. And what was really important to me is that there was this single hashtag that was used to index the Canadian general election, and that was ELXN43. Now 42 referred to the election previous to the 2019 election. And what you might notice is that this is a hashtag that's neither English nor French. It's a series of characters that sort of vaguely gives us reference to the fact that it's an election, but it's not a hashtag that would be intuitively one that would appeal to English speakers or French speakers, because it's one that could be used by both. And this relates to some of my previous research where I looked at the fact that certain hashtags are used by English speakers in Canada to refer to one issue, and the same issue is discussed by French speakers using a different hashtag. So the fact that there was a single hashtag allowed me to start to get to grips with what I was trying to get at, which was a community of politically engaged individuals interested in Canada, presumably Canadian, but not necessarily. So I had clear social criteria, but they didn't map on to linguistic criteria. And for me, that was really important because in Canada, the social at the national level does not map onto the linguistic. So I wasn't just looking at English and French either, I was looking at tweets in all languages. A very modest sized corpus, only 2.4 million words. So I think that's almost respectable, but not by any means something large by corpus standards these days. So I wanted to show you some of the ways that I'm trying to find or tackle these different forms of language ideologies that have been spelled out by Catherine Willard. So here, I'm not looking at the first one, which is material phenomena, but I'm going to try to show you the addressing embodied practices and dispositions, mental constructs, and verbalizations. Now, if you'll forgive a little bit of creativity, the first argument I want to make is that the use of a language is arguably an embodied practice. So when we choose to use French or English, whether we're speaking it or whether we're writing it down, we are undertaking a physical embodied practice of producing that language. And this is why, as a first step with this data set, what I tried to do was to account for which languages were in use. And I'm trying to consider those. And strictly speaking, it might not be what you'd think of intuitively as an embodied practice, but this is the argument that I'm trying to make. So in this data set, for example, multilingualism was pervasive. The FIRANT program that I used detected 39 languages in the data set, and that is a hugely important starting and ending point as well for the data that I'm looking at. You can also see by these figures that English was by far the most frequently used language and French the second most frequently used language, but to a much lower degree. The second category that I wanted to show you has to do with verbalizations. So on the one hand, I wanted to look at which languages were being talked about. And so I've given you some examples here of the frequencies that came out of the data, the most frequent ways, the most frequent terms relating to language that I started to look at. Language in the singular versus language in the plural, English language, looking at colocation, also looking at how immigrant languages tended to be named, whereas indigenous languages tended to be quantified. But that was only really possible to do once I had started to acknowledge the fact that of the extent of the multilingualism in the data. So in order to account for the other embodied practices in the data and to know the different verbalizations that could take shape, I also had to go searching for the French data. And that was only possible knowing that there was French in the data set because of the vastly different frequencies in the data set. So for reasons of time, I won't go into a lot of detail here. But the point is that there was far less French data than English data. So there's a question of how to account for the different sizes. But my argument is that there are two sides of the same coin, that embodied practices are intertwined with verbalizations. I could only know how language was being talked about in French because the frequencies were drowned out by the huge amount of English data if I had access to the fact that we had different embodied practices there. And in terms of looking for what is highly frequent, of low frequency, also have to consider absence. And I just see that the time passing very quickly, so I won't go into detail here. But Alan Partington has proposed this typology of absences, which can be addressed using Corpus tools. And this has proven to be a really useful resource for me when I'm trying to account for what is present in the data and why it's present according to what we know could have been present, because we can compare what is in our corpus against what is also in our corpus. And we can also compare our corpus against other corpora to try to account for what is happening. Okay, so to go back to verbalizations, the other way of looking at verbalizations is not just to see which languages are talked about, but how Twitter users talk about language. So here it's using colocation and concordance lines. And there are different examples of verbalizations in English and French. But again, there's only access to these if you can start to acknowledge that any identification of similarities or parallels or differences between English and French findings will depend on our ability to find them in the data. And if we rely purely on a frequency-based approach, we can lose sight of things that would normally be of lower frequency because of the nature of the data makeup. So in this example, what I'm showing you is that there were certain trends that I found in the English data, certain trends that I found in the French data, and certain trends that were found in both languages in terms of how language ideologies were being verbalized. Oh, my screen has gone a bit strange. I'm not sure if that is visible. Okay, hopefully this is, I think this slide shows now. Okay, so finally, moving on to mental constructs, this last area of forms of language ideology. And basically what I'm trying to present here are things that I'm still trying to grapple with. So there's no real answer to these questions, but it has to do with the way that the researcher helps to be able to identify what language ideologies are possible to identify in terms of how the corpus has been constructed. So in this case, the question is, in terms of the procedures followed, should the corpus of mixed language data be analyzed as a single mixed language corpus? Should automatic language detection be used, or should it be like tweets of different languages be manually separated? Do tweets in all languages need to be analyzed? Should language mixing, how should it be treated? How can it be accounted for using corpus methods? And then more generally, in terms of this is how I constructed this corpus, right? I told you that there was one hashtag that allowed both official language groups to participate, but there were other hashtags that I could have used. The PolCan, which is the Canadian politics hashtag used by French speakers, and the CDN Poly hashtag used by English speakers. They all relate to different ideas about what a meaningful community is. So more generally, my question is, how do researchers' language ideologies affect the ways in which corpora are conceptualized and therefore built? And how do mental constructs affect the results that we derive from our corpus analysis? Okay, so, and what I'm trying to argue more generally, just starting to wrap up here, is that these aren't isolated concerns. In real social contexts, language use is messy, it's mixed, it occurs in different quantities. And the mixing and the different quantities are manifestations of language ideology. So if we choose one language over another, for example, that's a form, I'm trying to say, of an embodied practice. But that presents a practical challenge. So the choice of one language over another results in different amounts of data. And while that might inconvenience us as researchers, it's an important language ideological choice that's been made by the person who produced the texts. So meaningful language ideological practices should not be overlooked simply for the ease of undertaking corpus research. And I don't really have the time to go into this, but I wanted to tell you that my problems are ongoing, and I'm currently looking at chief medical officers' tweets in Canada, and there are language factors, gender factors, and the fact that some people tweet still in mixed language, some people tweet in English and French, and these are all part of a community. So how do we account for, distinct language boundaries, mixed language boundaries, different amounts of data? So the chief medical officer of Quebec tweets in French, but only 8 tweets. These are all meaningful things. They're choices, but they produce a really challenging data set in terms of norms for corpus linguistics research. Okay, so the penultimate slide here, my argument is that frequency doesn't give us all the tools we need for every sort of research question. So just a nod back to McHenry and Hardy, who said this, and I pointed this out in the beginning. But I think we need to be creative and not rely on the basic corpus approaches. And I'm sure that people don't do this, but it is easy to do the more that corpus linguistics methods have been applied, broadly speaking, without accounting for the recent developments in applied and sociolinguistics with relation to superdiversity and translanguaging. So in order to keep on par with developments in the field more broadly, we have to be able to account for multilingual features in data beyond a frequency-based approach. And being critical of our own ideologies can ensure that corpora are built and analyzed in ways that produce findings that are socially meaningful. So they're meaningful in the context in which they emerge. And that will depend from one context to another. You can't assume that things will be meaningful of the same quantities or sizes and different rates of diversity in different contexts. So to conclude, I think it's important to show that language ideology research can benefit from corpus linguistic approaches. I haven't focused on that so much in this talk, but even the very fact that we have these big data sets now drawing from, I keep talking about Twitter. So we have new insights that are possible relating to verbalizations and embodied practices, and corpus linguistics can add to the existing body of work on language ideology. But I also think it's important that we recognize that corpus linguistics can benefit from a more comprehensive study of language ideology, especially in terms of insights for mental constructs that underpin corpus construction and analysis. And more broadly, I think that if we align corpus linguistics with language ideology, it would allow corpus linguistics to better contribute to developments in applied and sociolinguistics. And that is all.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much,
No problem.
Rachelle. Wow. What a thought-provoking talk, Rachelle, we have here. All right. So we can see some virtual clapping going on here. So yeah, brilliant. Okay. So I suppose we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So don't be shy for your questions through the chat box. Maybe I can start myself. I mean, I have so many questions for you, Rachelle, and you really made me think about how we approach data collection and data analysis, which I'm sure this is one of the things that you really have been working for some time now. So you mentioned that we should, I suppose, think about and consider multilingual features in our data beyond frequency. So I'm sure that you have your own views on this one, and let me break it to you. I come from, I suppose, applied linguistics and well, the compilation of learn a language back in the early 2000s. And at that time, we were not interested in multilingual features in a L2 language, which is probably now it's kind of something difficult to understand after the multilingual turn, and I suppose more awareness about the superdiversity contexts and all that. So what is your own view, your very personal view on how to approach these existence, of multilingual features in corpora or in data?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when we experience language, I think in our everyday life, not as an analyst, we end up excluding all the things we don't understand because it allows us to make sense of the world around us. So when we're walking, this is anecdotal and not empirical at all, but when we're walking anywhere, we hear things around us, we see signs and windows that we don't see. So it has to do with a normal thing that we do in terms of being able to make sense of the world. And when those are applied critically, uncritically to a corpus analysis, we're I don't think being our best research selves when we're doing that, because if we're trying to account for how meaning is made in a context generally, we shouldn't be excluding people who just are inconvenient for us being able to understand meaning. So I'm not sure if that answers your question at all, but that's sort of a little bit of personal experience that I think we all do it. So I don't think it's unusual.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. All right, so we have a few questions here. Well, of course, many tips here. Thank you, Rachelle. And it seems like pretty much everyone enjoyed your talk. So lots of thank yous here. Tania Tercero has a question for you. How do you choose the hashtag, and you did end up using, and if you looked at different options when choosing your hashtag?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, something I didn't go in detail in the talk is the idea of what a hashtag allows us to do is to look at a new kind of community, right? And it's not, we wouldn't even normally use the term community. We would use something like ambient affiliation or affinity space, because it doesn't have the same kind of boundaries. Even the notion that we have to grapple with these things like community, those terms are less used now, right? So I'm not losing sight of your question, I promise. But I am critical of my own use of this hashtag because it prescribes and it defines the extent to which I'm going to look at a community that's meaningful. So there are equally, there are other hashtags that could be used that would get at similar aspects of this topic. But long story short, the reason why I chose the ELXN43 hashtag was because I had looked previously at the PolCan and the CDN Poly hashtags and found that the English hashtag tended to be used by both English speakers and sometimes French speakers. But the French hashtag was almost exclusively used by French speakers. I also looked at things like how Canadian politicians use and sometimes generate new hashtags to appeal to different parts of the Canadian public. So I'm trying to train my eye to see the way that these hashtags help create ideas of community that are subjective, that fulfill political purposes, as in I can make sure that I'm really appealing to this group, but everyone else is just an overhearer or an eavesdropper on that conversation. But I think that the fact is that I am critical of my own use of that hashtag. It gives us a bit of a piece of a picture, but without knowing the other hashtags that are used, then it's only a partial view. So I'm not sure if that answers, but yeah, I think trying to be conscious of the bias that produces in the corpus building.
We have another question here. Angelito wants to ask you, well, thank you, Dr. Vessey. My first question is if you had to convey the notion of language ideology in a nutshell, what words would you use?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that. I said that one in the chat. If I'm trying to define the term, is that what it was?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. So we have this information. Yes.
Yeah, so until recently, I was using a lot the Catherine Willard definition, but there's also a definition by some more Canadian scholars, Annette Boudreau and Lise Dubois, and that's the one I've been using for a long time. So their beliefs about language that are so widely shared that they are taken as common sense. That's the way I understand it. And because they're taken as common sense, we have all these different forms that they can take shape as. But there's something very nuanced about what a language ideology is, as opposed to a language attitude, for example, which would be something by someone else. And I think because ideology is studied in corpus linguistics with relation to discourse, then it sort of attunes itself to corpus linguistic methods, at least somewhat, whereas I'd have to be more familiar with language attitude, for example, to know how it could be usefully married with or synchronized with corpus methods, but that would be an entirely different talk.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think. Sylvia Petersen, thank you very much, Rachelle. It was a very interesting and clear presentation. What corpus software would you recommend for analyzing a multilingual corpus like yours?
Yeah, that's another good question. I don't feel I did the best job, to be honest. I shouldn't be being so hard on my own research here, maybe, but essentially, I started using AntConc. I've used Wordsmith tools in the past, but I've never found a perfect fit. And to be completely honest with you, in this particular paper, I ended up using Excel quite a lot because it allowed a lot of different functions that, to be honest, weren't as monolingualizing. So still drawing on some of the principles, and I did try out AntConc, but it really ended up being Excel workbook that was most useful for me.
Okay. Sarah Fitzgerald, absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you so much. I totally agree with Sarah Fitzgerald. Ji Chen Du, hi, great talk. Wish to ask a question. How do you build the corpus? Any software? So I suppose, again, there is an interest in the software you used, especially how did you download all the tweets with the hashtag? Could you please talk a little bit more about your data collection and analysis methods? So probably analysis methods, I suppose.
Yeah, there are many more refined methods than I've used, but the one I used for this paper was the AntConc, FireAnt program, which is linked to AntConc. So in the end, it was useful because it collected things like the language in use. So it had an automatic language detection feature, which was really helpful. So yeah, FireAnt can get you so far, but I think the more tech savvy people are using things like Python and things I know absolutely nothing about. Should I go more about data collection analysis? I don't know.
Well, maybe yeah, data collection analysis, maybe, I suppose, if you want to say something on that one.
Yeah, well, I guess it sort of followed some of the order that I presented in terms of looking at which languages were in use first, to be conscious of not allowing the dominance of one language to drown out the possibility for frequencies to emerge in other languages. So it was really starting to account for the multilingualism in use first, and then looking at frequency and collocation after that, and then basically only trying to account for the meaning of frequency and collocation with respect to that awareness of the embodied practices or the actual languages in use.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask you how do you deal with, for example, retweets?
That's a great question. And I don't think there is consensus on this. So in this, in this paper, I did, yes, I did include the retweets as part of the frequency counts. But ultimately the frequencies were quite low. So I could go into further levels of detail. I think what's even more interesting than that is trying to grapple with things like the likes and the more interactive features to see that reception of what's being said. So that's, the next step, trying to account for that.
Okay.
I've seen researchers do different things with tweets in terms of excluding the retweets or counting them.
Yeah. I suppose that's an important decision that has to be acknowledged and discussed, I suppose. Yeah, great. Florian Assenhofer, thank you for your very informative talk. My question is, can or will the metadata of the tweet data set contribute to answering your research questions? And if that's the case, how do you think these metadata can help you?
Yeah. So I'm assuming by metadata you mean more about the people, so details about who they are and whatever we can glean from what comes from Twitter. So maybe, but there's so much anonymity on Twitter, and then there's the ethical side of whether or not that's possible to include. So I think maybe, but I did not do it, so all I would be doing is speculating in answering that. But I think there are difficulties in assuming that what information we glean from a data set from Twitter and whether or not that can be reliable because of all the false information that could be included. But that's speculation, unfortunately.
Okay. Ruth Kircha, I'd love to hear more about your new work about the tweets by chief medical officers.
Yeah, that's maybe another talk. Yeah, I'm presenting it on Friday at another conference. But it's just another challenging data set, because in that case, I'm looking at language, ideologies, and gender. So ideologies of language and gender. So it's a question of who's doing the tweeting, what is their, at least, the gender identity, how much do they use language, which languages do they use? And the focus underpinning that paper is looking at the different communicative labor undertaken by women and men. So then it really has the question of how much work are women and men doing in the chief medical officer role in Canada. Not only are there more women in that role, but there are more women in that role doing tweeting. There are also more women in that role actively tweeting, and there are more women in that role actively tweeting in English and French. So there's sort of multi-layers of how much the data has to be analyzed with respect to, in that case, the research questions. So without derailing the points I'm making here, but I wanted to show that it's not, the Canadian case, while it's one that I still focus on, I don't think is unique. And I think Twitter poses a lot of opportunities to get great big data sets, but also a lot of challenges in terms of how we grapple with them and make sense of what's happening in them.
Okay, Jane wants to know more about policy implications in your study.
Oh, that's
if any, right? So I suppose that's the main question.
I guess I haven't consider that. I should. I think that in terms of language policy in Canada, for example, I think I'd have to give that question some more thought. Otherwise, I think I might just be again speculating. But the idea is that it should contribute to our understanding of how current language policy is functioning in Canada. Does the existing official language policy work if we have these changes, and if people essentially aren't really talking about official languages that much, and when they are, they're not talking about it in the same way. But so far, no impact yet in that respect.
Yeah, maybe this is a silly question. Both French and English are official language.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah,
so that's different from the US.
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah, both languages are official, but lots of new challenges, the new Governor General of Canada, so that's the Queen's representative in Canada, so essentially, the head of government, does not speak French. So this was one of the biggest new debates to face in Canada about how Canada's official language policy hasn't caught up to speed with what the social changes actually are.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, more. I mean, there's so many questions here. We have a question from Shimei Sun. What's the most difficult thing you find, practical wise, when you were working with multilingual data in your corpus?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. I think in that case, it really depends on the research question. So for me, it was trying to make sure that I was accounting for it. That's probably the most difficult thing, is trying to make sense of the fact that there was so much multilingual data, that it was messy, and that it was there for a reason. So I think that's the real challenge, is interpreting it. I think so.
Okay, great. So yeah, I was just going through some of the questions here. So many. Well, Lilian Fortabong, I am doing research on a newspaper, Corpus. Found your presentation very helpful. Dr. Ahmed Abderraf, I think. What about the ideology taxonomy? So
yes,
maybe he wants to know more about that.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure I see the question. Doctor, is it?
Yeah, it's what about the ideology taxonomy? Or maybe that's in the context of Partington's 2014 taxonomy that you showed, maybe.
That was about absence more than.
Yeah, that was about absence, yes.
It had nothing specifically to do with ideology, but it could be applied to the study of ideology. And again, sorry, I felt that I was going on too much at that stage, so I didn't go into detail. But the idea is that if we're looking at how meaning, accounting for meaning according to frequency, he provides a really useful typology in terms of with practical implications for how to undertake it, for not just looking at what is high and low frequency, but also missing from the data. And there are all kinds of different ways to account for what is missing. I mean, absolute absence, relative according to what, right? So it is, I found it hugely instructive, and I haven't seen that paper cited in a lot of different places. So that's why, another reason I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's one of the areas where probably corpus linguistics methods probably can do better, I suppose. So one is absence, multilingual events or communication or usage probably is another one. So yeah, so much work to do. Tanya also mentions here Langsbox and says that Langsbox can use multiple languages. Yeah, maybe Tanya, maybe you want to say more about that. I'm not so sure whether that's the same as maybe Anconc, that can also read and work with multiple languages. I'm not sure if that's can actually deal with different languages in the same data set. So maybe you can say more about that. We have another question here. How by Dr. Ahmed, how could you decide on gender in view of a limited number of tweets? Well, that's a tough one. Maybe there's.
So gender is related to another project. That's the chief medical officer data. So there were nothing in that. The data that I showed in this presentation has nothing to do with gender.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, pretty much everybody says thanks here. Yeah, another question here. What were a couple of your findings related to language ideology and the tweets? Well, were a couple of your findings? I don't understand the question here very well. I suppose you highlighted 3 main findings, if I remember well.
I did, but I did go over them very quickly.
Yeah, maybe.
They meant to be illustrative because it wasn't really topic focused. It was more trying to show how, in order to account for how language is discussed, so the actual language ideologies and verbalizations, we need to account for the embodied practices, which I can see coming up. Yeah, so Tanya, I definitely did go over them very quickly. Maybe I could just refer you to the paper where I talk about them in more detail, because I'd be happy to share the paper with you, because I think at this stage might be too specific, not relating to the overall ideology. But I'd be happy to share the paper, so please do send me an email.
Great. We have a question from Angelito. Could you please elaborate on the notion of embodied practices in this context? I'm not sure if I was able to grasp what it means in this context.
Yeah, maybe I've been a bit creative with my use of the term, but for me, an embodied practice, as I understand it, is actually doing something with your body, right? And that is speaking a language. So if we're looking at a spoken corpus, then we're looking at the result of an embodied practice, right? And the same thing goes with writing. I'm trying to argue that writing is an embodied practice. So when we look at a corpus of written data, we are also looking, and same with tweeting, right? So anything we're producing, we're looking at it at that superficial level of these are words that I'm looking at, but we're overlooking the fact that a choice was made about how that language should be produced in one language or another, in language at all or not in language. So maybe it's a stretch, I don't know, but I found it useful for my own purposes.
Great. Okay, so yeah, pretty much, yeah, everybody says thank you. Rachelle, Barry, hi Barry. Very interesting talk, thanks. Thank you very much for this awesome talk, thought-provoking. Yeah, so yeah, there's a comment from Angelito again. I was trying to find the connection to Barcelo's work. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, it's getting late.
Yes, late there.
Okay, so thank you so much, Rachelle, for your talk and for your inspiration to do research in this area, and especially for a very thought-provoking presentation. I think I've heard you 2 or 3 times already, and it's been always a pretty much thought-provoking experience in terms of trying to think further, you know, like I think we are probably too comfortable using our techniques, our analysis with, you know, collocations, and then from time to time you get to hear really thought-provoking ideas about what you are doing, why you are doing that, and the extent of how these data that you are querying probably can really tell you more about some of your research questions. So I think this is one of those talks. So yeah, so thank you, Rachelle, and thank you everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, it was my pleasure. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you pretty much everyone. Around 100 people showed up today, which is massive, I think. So thank you everyone, and see you next week. Next week we have Dr. Chris Kyle on Tuesday, if I remember well. So don't miss out on that one either. All right, Rachelle, thank you so much. Thank you everyone. See you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye bye. Thank you.